Our real story begins with Lauren, who tells about her father and mother. Lauren's father married her mother, who was from a poor neighborhood in London, so he decided to build her a big house. Lauren's mother was happy with the house, and they decided to name it Clem, a mix of letters from her father's and mother's names. But after 1 year of their marriage, war was imminent. So Lauren's father decided to leave his wife with his mother because she was pregnant, and it was difficult to leave her alone in the big house. He decided to rent the house to Mr. Brown's family. Lauren's father volunteered for the army and would visit his wife every few weeks, and sometimes they would go together to check on the condition of the house. Years passed, specifically 6 years. Lauren grew up and started going with her mother to check on Clem to make sure it was all right. Mrs. Brown took care of the cleanliness of the house and maintained it as if it were still new. Until the year 1947, the war finally ended, and Lauren's father returned home. They decided to move back to their original home and live there as they had 7 years ago. Lauren's father informed Mr. Brown's family of their desire to move back to the house and gave them time to leave. At first, Mr. Brown's family agreed, but after a few weeks they completely changed their mind. Mrs. Brown clung to the house she had lived in more than they themselves had. After attempts by Lauren's father, he finally decided to proceed with legal action. Finally, the court ordered the Brown family to vacate the house. At that moment, Mrs. Brown looked angrily at Lauren's mother and told her she would never enjoy the house and would leave it against her will, just as she was forced to leave, because from that moment, it became cursed. Lauren's mother was surprised by Mrs. Brown's words. The two argued until the police had to forcibly remove Mrs. Brown from the court. Finally, Mr. Brown and his family left the house, and Lauren settled with her family in Clem. Lauren's father worked at a printing company, while her mother was busy renovating the furniture. Lauren went to school for the first time after the 7 years. Until one night in September, specifically a month after Lauren's family returned home, the family was sitting together in the living room. Lauren's mother heard the sound of a child screaming next to the living room window. Quickly went to look, but discovered there was no one. Lauren's father guessed it was probably a small animal, but Lauren's mother was certain there was no trace of an animal or even a child. And after a few days, the house phone rang, and Lauren's mother answered the phone. She began to hear the same sound of a child's screams she had heard before. Lauren's mother kept asking the caller to respond while she was in peak fear, but to no avail. On the same day, the call was repeated. The sound continued for about 3 or 4 minutes continuously until the caller hung up. So, Lauren's mother told her husband about what happened, guessing that Mrs. Brown was just bothering them. However, the same call kept coming to Lauren's mother, especially when she was alone in the house, as if the caller knew she was there. The calls repeated until Lauren's father decided to contact the telephone company and asked them to record all the numbers that contacted them. After 3 days in which Lauren's mother recorded every strange call she received with the timing to identify who called her at that time, Lauren's father contacted the telephone company to send him the call log. 2 days later, a telephone company worker arrived, started to investigate weirdly with Lauren's father and mother, as if something puzzled him, then looked at the phone to make sure it was working fine before leaving without doing anything. So, Lauren's father went to the telephone company and found out that every call they made was recorded, except for the ones at the times mentioned, meaning that more than 10 calls were not recorded, because no one actually called at those times. However, fortunately, Lauren's mother's neighbor was a witness to the calls, after she shouted for her during one of them. This reassured Lauren's mother that she was not crazy or imagining things, but that something strange was happening in the house. The calls continued until Lauren's mother got tired and decided not to answer the phone, agreeing with her husband on the times he would call so she would answer. After a while, Lauren's father was cleaning the garden, and there were 2 plates with different numbers hanging on the house door, fixed firmly with strong screws. At that time, a friend of Lauren's father arrived at the house, but as soon as he arrived, he looked at where the plates were and asked Lauren's father how he fixed the screws before the plate was placed. Father looked behind and was surprised that the plate had disappeared, but the screws were still fixed as they were. He quickly entered the house to call his wife, but as soon as he returned, he found the plate back in its place, despite being away for no more than 2 minutes. So, he decided to remove the screws and reinstall them as quickly as possible. However, he was surprised that no matter how fast, the least time it could take in such a process was 10 minutes. Lauren's father's friend laughed and said it seems there is an evil spirit residing in the house. Strange events continued to happen to Lauren's father and her mother until it happened to Lauren herself. Lauren went to wash her face in the bathroom and felt a strange pain on her chest. When she looked, She found a large bruise mark, proving what she had felt was real. Lauren's mother collapsed and decided that even if they found out what happened to the house, they could never live there again. After 3 days, Lauren's father managed to find a spiritual medium, and they went to the house together. As soon as they entered, the medium headed to the basement door, opened it, and upon descending saw the nanny lying on the floor. He asked Lauren's father to help him quickly take her to the hospital. They discovered she had been trapped in the basement for 3 days without food or water and was unable to speak. Her face bore the marks of distress and panic. The family stayed by her side until her health improved, but she did not speak a word. The doctor told them she was in shock, which sometimes happens when someone is trapped for a long time without knowing if they will live or die. The family returned to the house with the spiritual medium to continue investigating. The medium went down to the basement again, affirming it was the source of the evils in the house. He began touching various spots on the ground while reciting different spells. Suddenly, he told Lauren's father to prepare to call the police and began digging until they found the skeleton of a small child buried in the basement. Lauren's mother collapsed, and according to Lauren, she was quickly taken out of the house. The father called the police, who transferred the skeleton and began an investigation into the crime. During the investigation, Lauren's mother remembered that Mrs. Brown's family consisted of 3 people, including a small child. However, when she visited the house in the last year before moving there, she noticed the child's absence, but didn't pay much attention. Even on the day of the court, the child was also missing. The police investigation then focused on Mr. and Mrs. Brown, who were suspected of burying their child and possibly even killing him. Eventually, they were arrested, and Mr. Brown confessed that their son had died naturally, but since then, his wife had entered a state of nervous breakdown and decided to bury him in the house. When she knew they had to leave, she started performing rituals for a demon named Mary, meaning an evil demon, and directed a curse at Lauren's family and anyone who followed them because she believed they had deprived her of her son. Lauren recounts that after what happened, her family sold the house, and the new residents didn't experience anything strange, indicating that the curse was specifically aimed at Lauren's family only.